Episode 21, Astronaut Extraordinaire, Scott Kelly. Welcome to The Art of Excellence, a show about people doing extraordinary things in their lives. I'm your host, Glenn Zweig. Thanks for joining me. My guest today is Scott Kelly. Scott is a retired NASA astronaut and a veteran of 4 space flights. He is best known for spending nearly a year on the International Space Station and for spending more time in space than any other American. He recently wrote a book called Endurance: A Year in Space, A Lifetime of Discovery. Scott, welcome to the program.
Well, thank you.
Well, growing up, you weren't exactly the most motivated student, to say the least. You had finished in the bottom half of your high school class. I'm curious, was school really challenging for you, or were you just indifferent and didn't really try?
I think it was more that I didn't try because I couldn't pay attention. It's not that I didn't want to try. Beginning of every school year, I was motivated to do better, but that lasted all of like 2 or 3 days. And then I was kind of back to my old, habits of it being impossible for me to pay attention, it seemed like. And, I think if I was a kid today, I'd be one of the kids with ADD or ADHD, whatever the appropriate word is. At the time, that wasn't really a thing. And, I was just a bad student.
So there you are, you're barely getting by. I think you just snuck into college, and then you happen to grab Tom Wolfe's The Right Stuff, which would forever change your life. So what exactly happened?
Yeah, so I was in school, and one day I just happened to walk into the bookstore to buy gum or something, not a book. And I saw this book on the shelf, and it had a red, white, and blue cover and a cool title, and that made me pick it up, looked at the back, started paging through it, and was interested enough to take what money I had, and I purchased the book and went back to my dorm room and laid there for the next few days on my unmade dorm room bed and read the stories about the fighter pilots that became the test pilots that became the original Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo astronauts. And the book was The Right Stuff. And I just felt like I could relate to the guys. I felt like I had a lot of things in common with them, although I'm not exactly sure what that was. But at the time, I felt like I could relate to them. I guess mostly in terms of, being a risk taker and, just kind of living your life at, 100 miles an hour all the time. But I had one thing that I didn't have in common with them was that I was a bad student and I couldn't study. And so, having a career as a pilot or in the military or, possibly at NASA didn't seem possible, except, if I could fix that one thing, if I could, become a better student and do well in school, I felt like, well, maybe I had a shot at this. So, it was really just finding inspiration in this book that caused me to really buckle down and, teach myself how to pay attention and teach myself how to study. And it was not easy, but eventually I started doing better, and I just, took it from there. It was kind of a step-by-step process that, one step was built upon the other.
Well, you have a twin brother, Mark, who was going down that path at the time, and of course would eventually become an astronaut as well. Was he in any way inspiration for you back in that time of your life?
Well, he got his act together at a much younger age. My dad sat us down. Apparently, I don't remember this conversation. I was probably staring out the windows out the window at the squirrels or something. I don't remember this, but he sat us down and he told us how we, were not great students and we should start considering a career in some kind of vocational field. And my brother recalls thinking, well, I don't want to do that. I want to go to college. And then I think this was in the 8th grade, because in the 9th grade, he immediately started getting straight A's. And, me not having any memory of this conversation, I never got the message. And I just kind of continued to, meander through school, whereas he got his act together and did better from then on. So his path was a little smoother than mine.
So once you had this newfound direction, did you embark upon this journey, this very, very long journey, knowing that the odds were dramatically stacked against you? Or were you somehow able to convince yourself that you could defy the odds?
Well, I think the odds of becoming an astronaut are stacked against everyone, because there's so few opportunities compared to the people that want the job. But having the odds stacked against you is one thing, but never trying, the odds are, if you don't even try, the odds are zero. So I felt like, I at least had a chance if I could fix some issues I had in my life. But for me, I was motivated to be a pilot as well, and then be a test pilot on top of that, and then possibly an astronaut. And I felt like, well, at some point I'm not successful. Well, that's fine, because if I try and don't succeed, at least I tried. If I don't try, I don't have a chance, and I should still be, proud of my accomplishments, and hopefully I would have had a great career in the Navy as a Navy pilot if I never became an astronaut. So it's not like, if I didn't make it, I would be,
you'd be okay.
Yeah, it wouldn't be devastating, because at least I accomplished something on my path to space.
Well, you say in the book, what drew you to become a naval aviator and eventually a test pilot was doing something, and I think I'm quoting here, something immensely difficult, risking your life for it, and surviving. Now, there are certainly plenty of other paths you could have chosen in the Navy and elsewhere, which were mentally taxing without having to risk your life. So why did the heightened risk have to be part of the equation? Were you always drawn to risk?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, for some reason, I can remember from a little kid just doing like crazy stuff and, running everywhere and always jumping off of things and climbing things. And even when I read the book, The Right Stuff, I can remember reading one of the early passages about a guy crashing his airplane in the woods near, actually of all places where I am right now, Naval Air Station, Jacksonville, in the woods around here. And, the guys that went out to the wreckage were talking about the smell of the crash site, and the fact that one of their colleagues has gotten killed flying this airplane, and other guys later in the book died being test pilots and even astronauts. For whatever reason, that excited me. I was like, wow, I want to do that, which I know is kind of counterintuitive. Like, you wouldn't think an attraction to a job would be the fact that it's risky, but I think it is for some people, and it definitely was for me.
It sounds like eventually you applied for this astronaut training program almost on a whim. Like, you weren't thinking you had much of a shot at the time. You just didn't have enough experience. So were you completely shocked when you actually got accepted to it?
I was shocked when I got an interview. I wasn't completely shocked when I got accepted, only because I felt like my interview went really well. And then the application is somewhat of a process. So if you do well in the interview, later they start like doing background investigation, like a background investigation on you, and you get kind of a hint that you might get picked. So I wasn't as surprised when I got selected. But in retrospect, looking back on it, I went from this 18-year-old kid that was never able to do his homework, never did well in school, to this 18-year-old kid that read a book that got me moving in a right direction, to then fast forward 18 years later. It was kind of an 18-year journey from that point on to when I flew in space. And I was actually the first American in my class of 35 Americans to fly in space. It's pretty remarkable now that I think about it in that context.
Well, what do you think NASA saw in you? Why Scott Kelly? There's so many talented aviators out there, so many people with PhDs in every which discipline. Why you?
I don't know. I wasn't on that selection board. I was interviewing for it, but I wasn't privy to the conversations. At the time, I was a pretty good, test pilot. I was working in some interesting flight tests in, test programs at the Navy Flight Test Center. I think I did well in the interview. I think that helps. So, yeah, I would be the first to agree. There was probably a lot more qualified people than me out there. But
do you think they saw grit in you? The fact that you had these challenges when you were younger and overcame them, you think that might have been part of the draw?
I don't know if I was that honest about how I got started in the interview. Like I don't think I went in there at that time and said, yeah, I was always a crappy student. And then I read the right stuff and
I just figured NASA would have done background checks like out the wazoo all the way back to kindergarten. So they would have discovered it somehow.
They look at your grades in college, but for me, they looked at my grades of my last 4 years in college, not my first year. So they got better. I don't know. When I was on the selection board picking astronauts, the people that we interview are, considered qualified for the job. And then you're kind of looking for, personalities of people that you think you would want to work with. People that have demonstrated, teamwork and leadership and some other skills. I think in some ways my stories about, working on a ship in college and driving the ship and the, kind of hands-on skills that takes made me stand out, could possibly maybe stand out compared to the other interviewees.
Let's talk a little bit about the astronaut training itself. You say that training was the equivalent of getting a PhD. The myriad of subjects you had to learn, like geology, meteorology, physics, aerodynamics, sounds really daunting. And of course, not to mention learning all the complex systems of the space shuttle itself. It's pretty impressive for a kid who struggled academically throughout his childhood.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Do you sort of looking back to you, did you amaze yourself that you were able to do all that?
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable that I went from 18-year-old kid that couldn't do his homework or pay attention to fast forwarding 18 years later, being the first guy in his class to fly in space. And it was a lot of work. Each system on the space shuttle was as complicated as the airplane I flew in the Navy. I mean, the electrical system, I had to know more about the electrical system or the hydraulic system or the main engines and how to respond to failures. To know more about each of those, as well as others that I'm not even mentioning, than I did the whole F-14 Tomcat. And it took me, I started astronaut training in August of 1996, and I flew in December of 1999. I can remember, spending almost all of my spare time I had studying.
And when you're drinking through a fire hose like that, all these foreign subjects and just the amount that's thrown at you, was there ever any moment of doubt? Like, did you ever feel that you were just completely in over your head?
Yeah, I've always felt like that. I think that helps you.
In what sense?
I think I've always felt in over my head as far as being a good student. I wouldn't say I felt in over my head once I was, operating the space shuttle as a pilot or as a commander, but just being a good student has always been hard for me. Now, eventually I did better, but it wasn't easy. And I also felt kind of in over my head when I was writing this book. I think it's a story of my life. Maybe the title of the book, instead of Endurance, a Year in Space, a Lifetime of Discovery, should have been Endurance, I'm in over my head.
Be a catchy title. You point out that the fatality rate of astronauts flying on the space shuttle had a higher fatality rate than soldiers on the beaches of Normandy on D-Day. It sounds pretty intimidating. Were you ever afraid?
Yeah, when you're getting ready to fly in space, and you know how risky it is, it's something you think about, especially on your first flight. You think, this may very well be the last thing I ever do. You rationalize it because it's something you've worked hard for and you want to do. You believe in it. You think it's important. In the end, when you're strapped into the rocket and the clock is counting down, I don't know if the right word at that point is scared or afraid. I think by then you've kind of come to terms with what you're doing and you're busy and getting ready to launch. So you're distracted from being scared. But yeah, there's certainly, I think if anyone said they were never, a little bit worried when they're, strapped into a rocket with 7 million pounds of thrust behind them.
You're sitting on a bomb, essentially.
Yeah, they're not being probably completely honest.
Well, as you're fully aware, on February 1st, 2003, the Space Shuttle Columbia disintegrated during its re-entry, taking the lives of all 7 astronauts on board. One of them, I believe, a very close friend of yours. As I understand it, you were almost chosen to be on that fateful flight. Did you ever consider calling it quits after that tragedy? Did it give you pause in any way?
No, never caused me to think about quitting. I believe in NASA. I believe in what we do. I believe it's important despite the risk. And I felt like, and I think I was right, we would make the space shuttle better as a result of that, as a result of the Columbia accident. And we did. And we flew it safely for the remainder of the program.
Well, you mentioned it was 18 years and close to 2 decades of your life you essentially devoted to get to the point where you could finally get to space. And then there you are. You finally get your shot. I guess maybe the moment you exited the Earth's orbit here and got into weightlessness, what did it feel like? Was it everything that you had built up in your mind? Was it better?
Well, on my first flight, it was really an odd sensation because you're strapped into the seat so tightly that you really don't feel like, at least initially, that you're floating. I think even though I've floated before in an airplane for, 25 seconds at a time, doing that for a sustained period of time is a strange sensation. But being strapped into the seat doesn't make you feel like you're floating until you pick something up and like a checklist and just let it go and see it floating in front of your face. That, and when the sun came up, I think is the first time I realized, oh yeah, I'm in space. This is cool.
That's amazing. Well, I want to talk about the year on the space station, but before that trip, you had been diagnosed with a pretty aggressive form of prostate cancer. You had surgery, you had treatment. I hope all that's behind you now.
10 years.
10 years, that's great. Did the brush with your own mortality in any way alter your values or priorities?
I wouldn't say it was like a life-changing moment in that regard. I don't look at, it's interesting, like some people they seem to define themselves as like, I'm a cancer survivor. I don't really look at it that way for whatever. And I don't get me wrong. I don't begrudge anyone that, but I would never call myself that. I look at myself as being a guy whose prostate had cancer and it was removed. I don't identify with that. Maybe it's just me, and just like how I'm wired. I don't tend to dwell on stuff in the past. I think I'm pretty good at looking ahead and kind of ignoring the stuff that I have no control over or is something that happened to me in the past. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. I mean, it must have been pretty hard on your family, even if you were able to just sort of march through it.
Well, yeah, it's hard on your family. It's hard on you. I mean, the recovery is, really difficult. The surgery is difficult. I don't really think about it much. I did, think recently that, tomorrow actually, I had that surgery in November. I forget what day it was, but it was in November of 2007. So I'm coming up on 10 years. Understand that's a milestone.
That's a huge milestone. Your brother, by the way, as I understand it, had the same form of cancer. Did he approach it the same way you did?
Yeah, exactly the same way. Seems like it's genetic. I mean, it was Yeah, it was on the opposite side of his prostate as mine. Just like we have a little red birthmark on our foreheads on opposite sides of our heads. We're like mirror image twins. So if someone looks at one of us in the mirror, they think it's definitely the other guy.
Let's talk about the year that you had in space. Well, for starters, why a year? Were they hoping that the learnings could be used back here on Earth? Or was this more of a prelude for a long-duration space flight like to Mars?
Yeah, it's about going to Mars and being in space for longer periods of time than our current experience base, or at least our experience base in the U.S. with, an American astronaut and having the research capability we currently have on the space station. When we go to Mars, it's going to take, over 200 days to get there. You'll have to spend a year on the surface. It'll take over 200 days to get back. So, understanding how the human body and mind are affected by being in space longer is something that was of interest to NASA to support our exploration goals. So that's why we, with our Russian partners, decided to do this.
Well, when they first decided to put this together, it didn't sound like you were anxious to volunteer. What was the reluctance?
Well, I had just recently been in space. I think when we started talking about it, I had a little less than a year from when I was previously there. And when I was there last time for 159 days, that's a long time, 159 days. So I thought, do I want to do something that's more than twice as long? It wasn't that appealing to me. But I did want to fly in space again. When I started thinking about it and thinking about why I wanted to fly in space again, it was, because I liked the challenge of it, that I thought, well, this is going to be more than twice as challenging. That's right. So it's an idea that I kind of warmed up to over time.
Well, aside from the monotonous maintenance tasks and maybe a very occasional spacewalk, it seems like most of the work you do up there is to conduct science experiments, hundreds of them. Was being a scientist ever part of the allure for you, or was it really all about the adventure and nothing else?
The allure of me flying in space wasn't about me personally being a scientist. I enjoyed the work. I liked the very exacting nature of it. The fact that, you had to be technically very precise and accurate. In some cases, your ability to focus was, impacted your potential survival. If you made a mistake, you could die. And that is what I liked about it.
You say that the year in space tested your psychological endurance as much as your physical endurance. How so?
Well, you're in this confined environment with the same people. It's a risky place to be living. You always have to be prepared for a life-threatening emergency. I wouldn't call it stressful, but there is an underlying level of stress there that always exists because of the environment you're living in. And, that's what makes it challenging, which for me also made it appealing. But it's a psychological stress.
We'll talk about the isolation for a moment. How do you handle that? And in fact, how do they even screen for it? I imagine some people would go stir crazy just being away for that amount of time.
Well, one way they screened for this particular mission, being in space for a year or nearly a year, was they wanted you to have previously flown in space before on a long duration flight. You can spend 159 days in space and you do well at it, you can likely spend a year.
Well, how do they decide, I guess, backing up, who's even going to spend that, half a year or even 3 months out there, which is very different from going up for a few days and coming back?
That's very particular to whoever the chief of the astronaut office is deciding on who to assign. I can talk about, how they decided who to let or who was going to spend a year in space.
Sure.
There were certain requirements. You had to previously flown a long duration space flight, which, would satisfy the requirement that you wouldn't go like stir crazy there. You had to be able to be the commander of the space station because they wanted the American on this year-long flight was going to be the commander. We take turns, mostly between the U.S. and the Russians. You had to be able to do a spacewalk. Not everyone is qualified to do that. You had to be available, which actually excluded a lot of people, believe it or not. If you were in space, you couldn't, you weren't eligible if you'd just gotten back or if you were just getting ready to go. And then you had to be medically qualified. And there were a few different medical requirements. And when you put this filter on the whole astronaut office, in the end, there's me and another guy that were eligible.
So in what way would you say that space, or especially spending a year in space, changed you? I know you're not a religious man. Did it make you spiritual or more reflective in any way?
I think it makes you more reflective on the earth and, how lucky we are to have it. I think it makes you more of a person in tune with the environment and wanting to take care of it. And it also gives you more, empathy for humanity when you look out the window and you see, generally how beautiful the planet is, yet there's so much conflict and generally bad stuff going on down on Earth. It just makes you think that we need to work better, I think, to solve our common problems.
The book, again, is called Endurance, just like the title of the book detailing Ernest Shackleton's ill-fated journey to the South Pole. Were you trying to draw some sort of parallel between the two?
A little bit. Mostly just to kind of honor him and his crew. I think the title, though, speaks to my journey of endurance from kid that couldn't do his homework to guy who spends a year in space. The journey of endurance, the ship, and how it got crushed by the ice and sank, and then the crew had to live on an iceberg, and eventually they had to abandon that, and they went to this is in the Antarctic, and how they were able to survive almost 2 years, and they didn't lose one crew member. I felt like, the hardship they experienced was going to be nothing like what I could potentially experience. But if I ever felt sorry for myself and I thought how bad I had it, that I could just open pages of the book about Shackleton's journey and I would feel better about my situation.
Well, back to the topic of Mars for a moment. It seems like this is the great next frontier. It sounds fascinating, clearly on the surface. But just to play devil's advocate, why spend tens of billions of dollars to send humans to Mars? What do we hope to accomplish other than curiosity?
I think there's a lot of things we get out of it. I think humans are explorers by nature, and I think it's part of our DNA to explore. I think that, if we don't continue to try to, push our boundaries and advance our society, we were going to cease to exist at some point. I think that's been demonstrated throughout history, that nations that look inward and don't continue to try to develop don't cease to exist. I think we get a lot of returns with technology. We develop, advanced technology to fly in space. It's why we have, computers in our pockets now. I think it's one of the reasons why we have computers in our pockets now that are much more powerful than what we used to go to the moon. If we got nothing else from the space program other than millions of kids in this country being motivated to study STEM subjects and become scientists and engineers, all these jobs that are important to our economy, if the only thing we got out of going to Mars and the investment was that kids in this country all want to be astronauts and therefore do better in math and physics and then later become, get these jobs that build things and invent things. If that's all we got out of it, I think it'd be worth the money. Plus, it'd be really cool.
So let's say when we wrap up this interview, the phone rings. It's NASA calling. Listen, Scott, I know you're retired, but we need someone to go to Mars. We need someone to lead that journey. And no one has had a year-long duration in space like you have. We need you to come out of retirement. What do you say?
Well, sign me up. I'm in.
You're in?
Yep.
I couldn't tell if that year on the station was sort of the end for you or...
No, it's probably the end. I don't think NASA's going to call me. They have plenty of people that are talented and capable to do this. They don't need me.
When do you think it's going to happen?
No idea. We could do it now. I mean, it's more of a money issue than anything else.
How are you feeling these days? Have you completely recovered or are there still lingering effects?
No effects that I can feel.
And how long did it take to get to that point?
Until I felt completely back to normal, probably about 8 months.
Are there things we've learned from that year that are going to be very instrumental in trying to figure out this Mars trip?
I hope so. There's some interesting things they've learned, but I'm not, privy to most of it. But I hope so. That's why I did it.
So what's the next chapter look like for you? What does a retired astronaut do to stay engaged in life?
Right now, I do a lot of interviews because I have this book that came out a couple of weeks ago. I had no idea that writing a book and doing the book tour after would be almost as hard as spending a year in space.
And once the tour is over, then what? Any ideas?
No, I'll have to figure that out next year, maybe. We'll see. I'll figure something out.
So it's been a remarkable career. When you look back over all these decades, your career, your life, who would you say has had the greatest influence on you?
Probably my brother. I think we were just kind of in this together, for a lot of it. We rely on each other for counsel and advice and, have for a really long time.
You had also mentioned in the book how at one point your mother had to pass some really rigorous physical tests to make it into the police force, which she did. Was she a good role model there? Did she inspire you?
Yeah, absolutely. Seeing her, have this goal that was at the time, something that didn't seem possible, and then working hard at it and achieving it was definitely had an impact on Mark and I. She was the first female police officer in our hometown. Yeah, I think it had a big impact.
So if you go back in time, and let's talk about before you picked up whatever copy you did of The Right Stuff, when you didn't have that guiding light, you go back in time and you give the young Scott Kelly, still struggling, trying to figure out his direction, some advice. What would you say?
Pick up that book, The Right Stuff.
But let's say it's someone else out there and they aren't driven to risk or space like you were, but they're just struggling. They just don't seem to have any inspiration, any motivation. What do you say?
I would say look hard for the inspiration and motivation, because I know in my case, I really wanted to do well, but it was impossible until I found the reason why I had to do well. And it was because I wanted to become a pilot and an astronaut. And I would just say, look wherever you can for that thing that you want to do that necessitates you be a better performer, whether that's in school or, elsewhere in your life. Find that spark, gets you moving in the right direction.
Well, the name of this podcast is called The Art of Excellence. What's your definition of excellence?
I don't know. I usually describe myself as a below average guy doing a slightly above average job. Whenever I was doing something technically complicated, I would think back to my Navy days and how, to land the F-14 on the aircraft carrier, Navy used the term compartmentalize, focus on the things you could control and ignore what you can't. This level of hyper focus on certain things sets the Navy apart from other areas of aviation where, the consequences are not as great as when you're landing on the ship. Perhaps I would define it as the ability to focus, 100% of your effort and attention on one thing. And hopefully that'll make you good at it. It might not, but it'll probably make you as good as you can be.
That works for me. I like that answer. Scott, this has been a really insightful interview. Thank you so much for being a part of this.
Yeah, thank you, Glenn. Appreciate the time.
Hey, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. You can subscribe to the show at iTunes, Stitcher, and theartofexcellence.com. I've got one small favor to ask. If you like the show, please take a minute and leave us a review on iTunes. I would really appreciate that. I'll see you next time.